Before we dive into one of history's most improbable military victories, let me ask you something. What happens when an army that's been starving for months, reduced to eating their horses and boiling leather, faces a fresh relief force twice their size? Logic says they surrender. History says they die. But on June 28, 1098, outside the walls of Antioch in what is now southern Turkey, the First Crusade did neither. They marched out of a city they'd barely conquered, fielded an army of walking skeletons, and obliterated a 40,000-man Islamic coalition that had come to crush them. This isn't a story about faith or divine intervention. This is a story about desperation, deception, and one of the most audacious gambles in medieval warfare. No fluff, no romanticism, just the facts, the decisions, and the consequences. If this sounds like history worth knowing, hit that like button and drop a comment. Now, let's go back to 1098 and watch the Crusaders do the impossible. To understand how we got here, you need to understand what the First Crusade actually was. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a crowd at Clermont in France and called for a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. This wasn't a carefully planned military campaign with professional armies and clear command structures. This was tens of thousands of knights, soldiers, and common people from across Western Europe, all heading east with different motivations, different leaders, and no unified strategy. Some came for religious salvation, some came for land and wealth, some came because their Lord came and they had no choice. By the time this massive, chaotic migration reached Byzantine territory, Emperor Alexios Komnenos in Constantinople was horrified. He'd asked for mercenaries to help reclaim lost territory. Instead, he got a barely controlled horde that threatened to destabilize his entire empire. But the Crusaders pushed forward. They crossed into Anatolia, fought the Seljuk Turks at Dorsalium, and by October 1097, they arrived at Antioch. Here's what you need to know about Antioch. This city was one of the greatest fortresses in the world. Built on the Orontes River near the Mediterranean coast, protected by mountains on one side and massive walls on the other, Antioch had walls that stretched for miles, punctuated by over 400 towers. The fortifications climbed up Mount Silpius, making assault nearly impossible. Inside those walls sat Yaghisian, the Turkish governor, commanding a garrison that could hold out indefinitely if supplied properly. The Crusaders arrived with maybe 40,000 men. They looked at those walls and realized something immediately. They couldn't storm this city. They would have to starve it out. So began one of the strangest sieges in history. The Crusaders surrounded Antioch, but here's the problem. They didn't have enough men to fully encircle the city. Gaps in their siege line meant supplies kept trickling into Antioch, while the Crusaders themselves struggled to feed their own army. Winter arrived. Food became scarce. The surrounding countryside had been stripped bare. Foraging parties had to travel farther and farther, and Turkish cavalry constantly harassed them. Men started dying, not from battle, from hunger, from disease, from exposure. Horses died by the thousands. Knights who had ridden to war on expensive war horses were reduced to walking. Some Crusaders began eating their dead horses. Others boiled leather straps to extract any possible nutrition. Desertion became rampant. Prominent nobles abandoned the siege and fled back toward Constantinople, citing impossible conditions and certain death. By early 1098, the situation was critical. The Crusaders had been outside Antioch for months, achieving nothing except their own slow destruction. Inside the city, Yaghisian watched and waited. He knew relief was coming. He'd sent messengers to Mosul, to Damascus, to every Muslim power in the region, begging for help. And help was coming. Kurboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, was assembling a massive coalition army, 40,000 men, fresh troops, fully supplied. Kurboga wasn't just bringing soldiers. He was bringing siege engines, engineers, and enough provisions to sustain a long campaign. His objective was simple: crush the Crusaders completely, relieve Antioch, and drive these foreign invaders back into the sea. The Crusader leaders knew about Kurboga. They knew time was running out. If they didn't take Antioch before that relief army arrived, they would be caught between the city walls and Kerbogha's forces. Annihilation. So they doubled down on the siege, built more fortifications, and tried to tighten their blockade. But the city wouldn't fall. Months passed. Men kept dying. And then something extraordinary happened. A single traitor changed everything. Inside Antioch, there was a man named Firuz. He was an Armenian Christian who had converted to Islam and now commanded one of the towers on the southern wall. The sources differ on his exact motivations. Some say he was genuinely sympathetic to the Christians. Others claim he had a financial dispute with Yaghisian and sought revenge. What matters is this. Firuz made contact with Bohemond of Taranto, one of the most ambitious and ruthless Crusader leaders. Bohemond was a Norman adventurer from southern Italy, and he saw an opportunity. Firuz offered to let Crusader troops into the city through his tower at night. In exchange, Bohemond wanted control of Antioch once it fell. The other Crusader leaders were suspicious. They questioned Bohemond's motives. But desperation silences suspicion. They agreed. On the night of June 2nd, 1098, a select group of Crusaders approached the southern wall under cover of darkness. Firuz lowered ladders from his tower. The Crusaders climbed silently, terrified that at any moment they'd be discovered and slaughtered, but they made it. Once inside the tower, they secured it, opened a nearby gate, and suddenly thousands of Crusaders were pouring into Antioch. The city descended into chaos. Turkish defenders, caught completely off guard, scrambled to mount a defense. Street fighting erupted throughout the city. Yaghisian, realizing the city was lost, fled through a northern gate with a small group of followers. He never made it far. His horse threw him, and he was killed by Armenian peasants who found him wandering in the countryside. By dawn on June 3rd, the Crusaders controlled Antioch. They had won, except they hadn't. Not really, because 3 days later, on June 5th, Kerbogha's massive relief army arrived outside Antioch. The Crusaders, who had just spent 8 months besieging a city while starving, were now trapped inside that same city, being besieged themselves. And they were in far worse condition than the Turks had been. When the Crusaders took Antioch, they found that Yaghisian had stockpiled very little food inside the city. The garrison had relied on resupply through the gaps in the Crusader siege lines. Now those supplies were cut off. The Crusaders, already weakened from months of starvation, were trapped inside a city with almost no food, surrounded by a fresh, well-supplied army that outnumbered them significantly. Kerbogha's army settled in for a siege. They built fortifications. They controlled all the gates. They cut off every supply route. Inside Antioch, conditions deteriorated immediately. Men were already dying from starvation before the siege even began. Now it accelerated. Soldiers collapsed from hunger in the streets. Some Crusaders attempted to escape by climbing down the walls at night and fleeing toward the coast. Many were caught and killed. Those who made it became known as rope dancers because they descended the walls on ropes in the darkness. Morale shattered. The crusade, which had seemed on the verge of triumph just days earlier, now appeared doomed. Trapped inside a city with no food, no hope of resupply, and no realistic chance of fighting their way out. This is where most stories would end. Surrounded, starving, outnumbered. History has seen this scenario 1,000 times. The outcome is always the same, but then something strange happened. A French peasant named Peter Bartholomew came forward with a vision. He claimed that Saint Andrew had appeared to him in a dream and revealed the location of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion. According to Peter, this relic was buried beneath the floor of the Cathedral of St. Peter inside Antioch. The Crusader leaders were skeptical. Visions and relics were common medieval propaganda tools, often fabricated to boost morale or manipulate the faithful. But desperation breeds belief. They allowed Peter to dig beneath the cathedral floor. After hours of digging, he emerged holding a piece of iron that he claimed was the Holy Lance. Whether it was genuine, whether Peter planted it himself, whether the leaders fabricated the entire event, none of that matters. What matters is the effect. The discovery electrified the Crusader army. Men who had been contemplating surrender or death suddenly believed they had divine favor. Priests preached that God had delivered them a sign, that victory was assured if they had faith. Morale, which had been non-existent, surged. But morale doesn't win battles, strategy does, and the Crusader leaders knew that even with renewed faith, they faced impossible odds. They were still starving, they were still vastly outnumbered. Kerbogha's army was still fresh and well supplied. Sitting inside Antioch and waiting meant slow death. So they made a decision that defied all military logic. They would march out of the city and fight. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders prepared for battle. They organized their remaining forces into divisions, each commanded by one of the principal leaders. Bohemond commanded one division. Raymond of Toulouse, despite being ill, commanded another. Godfrey of Bouillon, Robert of Flanders, Robert of Normandy, all the major leaders took command of units. The total Crusader force numbered somewhere between 15 and 20,000 men. Many were so weak from starvation they could barely hold their weapons. Some had no horses. Knights who had spent their entire lives training to fight on horseback were now infantry. They had almost no cavalry left. Across from them, Kerbogha commanded 40,000 fresh troops, including significant cavalry forces. On paper, this was a massacre waiting to happen. The Crusaders' plan relied on one critical element: surprise. Kerbogha knew they were starving. He expected them to either surrender or attempt a desperate breakout that his forces could easily crush. What he didn't expect was an organized, aggressive attack. The Crusaders would exit through multiple gates simultaneously, deploy rapidly into battle formation, and hit Kerbogha's forces before they could properly respond. It was audacious. It was insane, and they had no other choice. Early in the morning on June 28th, the gates of Antioch opened. Crusader divisions poured out, moving as quickly as their weakened bodies allowed. They formed up into a battle line, banners raised, the Holy Lance carried at the front by Raymond of Aguilas, the priest who had supervised its discovery. Kerbogha's army saw them coming. Officers shouted orders. Troops scrambled into position, but the speed and aggression of the Crusader advance caught them off balance. Here's what you need to understand about medieval battles. They're not the chaotic mob fights that movies portray. Armies that break formation die. Armies that maintain cohesion and momentum can punch through forces much larger than themselves. The Crusaders, despite being starving and exhausted, maintained formation. They advanced in disciplined lines, each division supporting the next. Kerbogha's forces attempted to encircle them, to use their superior numbers to surround and crush the Crusaders. Turkish cavalry swept around the flanks, firing arrows, trying to break the Crusader formations. But the Crusaders held. They kept moving forward, and then they hit Kerbogha's center. Medieval combat at close range is butchery, men hacking at each other with swords, axes, maces, shields splintering, armor denting, blood everywhere. The Crusaders, who had nothing to lose, fought with the desperation of men who knew retreat meant death. Kerbogha's troops, who had expected an easy victory over a starving rabble, found themselves facing an enemy that wouldn't break. The Crusader divisions pushed deeper into Kerbogha's lines. Turkish cavalry continued harassing the flanks, but they couldn't stop the advance. And then something unexpected happened. A portion of Kerbogha's army began to waver. The sources disagree on exactly why. Some claim dissension among the coalition leaders. Kerbogha had assembled this force from multiple Muslim states, and not all of them trusted each other or were committed to the fight. Others suggest panic spread as the Crusaders continued their seemingly impossible advance. Whatever the cause, sections of Kerbogha's army started to pull back. Bohemond saw it. He ordered his division to exploit the gap, to drive deeper into the Turkish lines. The other Crusader divisions followed. What had been a controlled defensive battle transformed into an aggressive push. Kerbogha tried to rally his forces, tried to bring his numerical superiority to bear, but momentum had shifted. The Crusader advance didn't stop. Men who shouldn't have been able to stand, much less fight, were driving forward with fanatical energy. Turkish units that had expected to sweep aside a broken enemy instead found themselves being pushed back. And then Kerbogha's army broke. Not in one dramatic moment, but in a cascading collapse. Units retreated, which caused neighboring units to retreat, which caused panic to spread. What had been an organized army disintegrated into a fleeing mob. The Crusaders pursued, cutting down anyone they caught. Kerbogha himself fled the battlefield, his massive coalition shattered. The battle lasted several hours. When it ended, the field was covered with Turkish dead. The Crusaders had won against 40,000 fresh troops, while starving, with a fraction of their original strength. It shouldn't have been possible. Military historians still debate exactly how it happened. Was it Kerbogha's overconfidence? Was it genuine dissension among his coalition? Was it simply that the Crusaders' desperate aggression caught a complacent enemy completely off guard? All those factors played a role. But here's the truth that doesn't require divine intervention to explain. The Crusaders gambled everything on a single audacious attack. They moved fast, maintained cohesion, and hit an enemy that wasn't psychologically prepared for serious resistance. Kerbogha expected a siege, a slow starvation, possibly some minor breakout attempts he could easily crush. Instead, he got an aggressive, organized assault that exploited his army's weaknesses before he could leverage his advantages. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Kerbogha's fleeing army abandoned their camp, leaving behind enormous quantities of supplies, weapons, food, gold, everything. The Crusaders, who hours earlier had been on the brink of starvation, suddenly had more food than they could carry. They looted the Turkish camp for days. Men who had been eating leather were now feasting on provisions meant for 40,000 soldiers, but the strategic consequences went far beyond full stomachs. Kerbogha's defeat sent shockwaves through the Muslim world. The largest coalition assembled to stop the Crusades had been annihilated. Cities throughout Syria and Palestine, which had been preparing to resist the Crusaders, now reconsidered. Fear spread. If Antioch and Kerbogha couldn't stop these foreigners, who could? The Crusaders remained in Antioch for months, recovering, consolidating control, and arguing over who would rule the city. Bohemond claimed it based on his prior agreement and his role in the city's capture. Other leaders disputed this, arguing the city should go to the Byzantine emperor as originally promised. The dispute nearly tore the crusade apart. Eventually, Bohemond won. He established the Principality of Antioch, one of the Crusader states that would endure for nearly 2 centuries. But that's a different story. What matters here is that the victory at Antioch kept the First Crusade alive. Without it, the entire campaign would have ended in that city, with every crusader dead or captured. Instead, they continued south. 13 months later, in July 1099, they captured Jerusalem. Let's talk about Kerbogha for a moment. After his defeat, he returned to Mosul in disgrace. His reputation never recovered. The coalition he'd assembled fractured, with different Muslim rulers blaming each other for the failure. Kerbogha had been one of the most powerful military leaders in the region. After Antioch, he faded into irrelevance. He died a few years later, his name forever associated with one of Islam's most humiliating defeats during the Crusader period. The irony is brutal. He had everything he needed to win: superior numbers, better supplies, a strategic position. He lost because he underestimated a starving enemy and failed to adapt when that enemy refused to behave as expected. Now, let's address the elephant in the room: the Holy Lance. Did it actually turn the tide? From a purely military standpoint, no. A piece of iron, real or fabricated, doesn't change tactical realities, but psychological warfare matters. The lance gave the Crusaders something to rally around. It transformed their mindset from "we're going to die" to "we're going to win." That shift in morale absolutely affected their performance on the battlefield. Men fight differently when they believe victory is possible. So while the lance didn't physically harm Kerbogha's army, it armed the Crusaders with something almost as valuable as food or weapons: hope. And in a siege situation where despair was killing as many men as starvation, that mattered. But strip away the religious elements, strip away the mythology, and here's what you're left with. A commander who saw his options and chose the most aggressive, least predictable course of action. Bohemond and the other Crusader leaders knew that conventional tactics were suicide. Staying in Antioch meant slow death. Surrendering meant immediate death, so they attacked. They moved fast, maintained discipline, and exploited their enemies' complacency. It worked, not because of miracles, because of ruthless pragmatism disguised as faith. The Crusaders didn't pray their way to victory. They fought their way to victory and then thanked God afterward. That's not cynicism. That's just how medieval warfare worked. Religion motivated. Strategy 1. The Siege of Antioch also exposed fundamental weaknesses in the Islamic response to the Crusades. Kerbogha's coalition represented multiple rival powers who barely cooperated. They had no unified command structure, no shared strategic vision, just a loose agreement to oppose the Crusaders. When pressure mounted, that coalition cracked. The Crusaders, despite their internal disputes, maintained enough cohesion to function as a unified force when it mattered. That organizational advantage, more than individual bravery or tactical brilliance, explains much of their success. Unity beats division, desperation beats complacency, and aggression beats hesitation. Those aren't religious lessons, they're military ones. Here's something else worth noting. The common Crusader soldiers, the ones who aren't named in the chronicles, endured unimaginable suffering at Antioch. Months of starvation, disease, watching their friends die, then being asked to march out and fight a vastly superior force. Most of them weren't knights seeking glory. They were regular people who got caught up in this movement and ended up in hell. When those men walked out of Antioch on June 28th, they did something extraordinary, not because they were heroes or fanatics, but because they had no other choice and somehow found the strength anyway. History tends to focus on the leaders, the famous names, but wars are fought by thousands of anonymous people making impossible decisions every day. Antioch was won by starving men who should have been dead. The strategic impact of Antioch resonated for decades. The Crusader victory there established them as a genuine threat, not just a temporary nuisance. Muslim rulers who had initially dismissed the crusade as a passing problem now understood they faced an existential challenge. This led to defensive preparations, but also to prolonged disunity as different Islamic powers competed rather than cooperating. The Crusader states exploited those divisions for generations. If Kerbogha had won at Antioch, if he'd crushed the Crusaders there, the entire history of the Levant would have changed. No Crusader kingdoms. No centuries of conflict. Jerusalem stays in Muslim hands. The trajectory of Christian-Muslim relations shifts dramatically. One battle, everything changed. Now let's talk about Bohemond specifically. He's a fascinating character. Before the Crusade, he was a landless Norman adventurer. His father, Robert Guiscard, had conquered southern Italy, but Bohemond inherited nothing. He joined the Crusade partially for religious reasons, but primarily because he saw an opportunity to carve out his own kingdom. At Antioch, he secured exactly that. The Principality of Antioch became his power base, and he ruled it until his death in 1111. Bohemond was ruthless, ambitious, and pragmatic. He manipulated the discovery of the lance to his advantage. He exploited the battle's outcome to claim Antioch despite Byzantine objections. He was everything people imagine when they think of a medieval warlord. Not particularly noble, not particularly pious, just effective. Raymond of Toulouse presents a contrasting figure. He was older, wealthier, and genuinely devout. He opposed Bohemond's claim to Antioch, arguing the city should be returned to the Byzantine emperor as promised. Raymond saw the crusade as a holy mission. Bohemond saw it as conquest. That tension between religious idealism and naked ambition defined the entire First Crusade. At Antioch, both impulses existed simultaneously. Men prayed to the Holy Lance and then looted the Turkish camp with equal enthusiasm. They thanked God for victory and then fought each other over who got to rule the conquered city. That contradiction is what makes this history compelling. These weren't saints or villains. They were humans, messy and complicated, doing terrible and extraordinary things. The siege and battle also demonstrated the importance of intelligence and espionage. Firuz's betrayal gave the Crusaders entry to the city. Without that single traitor, they likely would have remained outside Antioch until Kerbogha arrived, at which point they would have been crushed between the city garrison and the relief army. One man changed the entire outcome. That's not unusual in medieval warfare. Cities fell constantly due to betrayal, bribery, or infiltration. The Crusaders understood this. They actively sought out disgruntled insiders, made promises, offered money. When frontal assault wasn't possible, subterfuge became the weapon. Modern military doctrine calls this unconventional warfare. Medieval commanders just called it common sense. The timeline matters here. The Crusaders began besieging Antioch in October 1097. They captured the city on June 3, 1098. That's 8 months. Then Kerbogha arrived on June 5 and besieged them. The Crusaders endured that siege for 23 days before launching their attack on June 28. In total, they spent nearly 9 months in and around Antioch, most of that time starving. Think about that duration. Not a quick campaign, not a brief hardship. 9 months of slow, grinding suffering punctuated by moments of terror. And then, at the absolute lowest point, they attacked and won. The psychological resilience required for that is staggering. Most armies would have collapsed. Most leaders would have surrendered. But the Crusaders, for all their flaws, possessed a kind of stubborn refusal to accept the obvious outcome. After Antioch, the Crusades' momentum shifted. They'd proven they could defeat major Muslim armies. They controlled a strategic city. Morale, shattered so many times, was now unbreakable. When they eventually resumed the march toward Jerusalem, local rulers paid attention. Some negotiated, some surrendered without fighting. The psychological impact of Antioch preceded them like a shockwave. Fear is a weapon. The Crusaders, who had been dismissed as doomed fanatics, were now feared as unstoppable conquerors. That reputation, earned in blood at Antioch, carried them all the way to Jerusalem. But let's not romanticize this. The Crusaders committed atrocities throughout their campaign. When they captured Antioch initially, they massacred much of the Turkish garrison. When they later captured Jerusalem, they slaughtered thousands of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. These weren't noble warriors fighting clean wars. They were brutal conquerors who saw non-Christians as enemies to be eliminated. The Battle of Antioch was a remarkable military achievement. It was also part of a larger campaign of violence and conquest. Both things are true. History doesn't care about making people comfortable. It cares about what actually happened. And what happened was that starving Crusaders won an impossible battle, then used that victory to continue a campaign that would result in decades of warfare and suffering. The sources for Antioch come primarily from Crusader chronicles written by participants or near contemporaries. The Gesta Francorum, an anonymous account. Raymond of Aguilar's, who carried the Holy Lance into battle. Fulcher of Chartres. These are first-hand or near first-hand sources, but they're also biased. They portray the Crusaders as divinely favored heroes and the Muslims as infidels worthy of death. Muslim sources from the period provide different perspectives, often emphasizing the tragedy of Antioch's fall and Kerbogha's failure. Modern historians cross-reference these accounts, trying to extract factual events from propaganda. What emerges is a story that both sides agree on in broad strokes. The Crusaders were starving and trapped. Kerbogha arrived with overwhelming force, and somehow the Crusaders won anyway. One tactical detail worth examining: the Crusaders' use of terrain. When they exited Antioch, they deployed on the plain in front of the city, but they kept the walls at their back. This meant Kerbogha couldn't fully encircle them without exposing his own forces to sorties from the city or creating gaps in his line. The Crusaders essentially used Antioch's walls as an anchor, limiting Kerbogha's ability to use his numerical advantage. It's a subtle tactical choice, but crucial. In medieval battles, being surrounded meant death. By controlling their flanks with terrain, the Crusaders forced a frontal engagement where discipline and momentum mattered more than raw numbers. Kerbogha had the troops to encircle them, but the tactical geometry of the battlefield made it difficult to execute without creating vulnerabilities. The Crusaders didn't just stumble into victory. They used every advantage available, including geography. The aftermath of the battle also saw significant defections from Kerbogha's army. Once the main force broke, many soldiers and commanders simply went home. They hadn't been invested in the fight to begin with. They were there because their lords commanded it or because they feared appearing weak. When the battle turned against them, that shallow commitment evaporated. Compare that to the Crusaders, who had nowhere to go. Retreat meant a 1,000-mile journey back through hostile territory. They had to win or die. That existential motivation created a kind of battlefield intensity that Kerbogha's coalition couldn't match. Desperation is a force multiplier. Let's also talk about logistics, because that's what actually wins wars. The Crusaders' supply situation at Antioch was catastrophic. They had no secure supply lines back to friendly territory. Everything they ate had to be foraged, traded, or captured. As the siege dragged on and the surrounding area was stripped of food, starvation became inevitable. Kerbogha's supply lines were longer but intact. He had routes back to Mosul and other friendly cities. He could resupply. The Crusaders couldn't. That's why the battle had to happen when it did. Wait any longer, and the Crusaders would have been too weak to fight. Attack earlier, and they'd face an enemy more prepared. Timing mattered. The decision to attack on June 28th was calculated based on maximum desperation but minimum physical collapse. It was the last possible moment they could field an army. The Holy Lance continued to be controversial even after the battle. Some Crusader leaders privately expressed doubts about its authenticity. Peter Bartholomew, the peasant who discovered it, faced accusations of fraud. Eventually, he offered to undergo trial by ordeal to prove the lance's authenticity. He walked through a path of burning coals. He died from his injuries days later. Whether the lance was real or not died with him. But again, it doesn't matter. The lance served its purpose. It rallied the troops when nothing else could. Whether it was a genuine relic or a calculated propaganda tool, it worked. That's all military history cares about. Did it achieve the objective? Yes. Everything else is theology. The Battle of Antioch also demonstrated the limits of numerical superiority without tactical cohesion. Kerbogha had twice as many men as the Crusaders. In theory, that should have been insurmountable, but numbers mean nothing if they can't be effectively deployed. Kerbogha's coalition included troops from Mosul, Damascus, Aleppo, and other cities. They spoke different languages, followed different commanders, and had different strategic priorities. When the battle turned against them, that fractured command structure collapsed. The Crusaders, despite their own internal disputes, had unified field command during the battle. Each division knew its role. Each leader coordinated with the others. That organizational advantage neutralized Kerbogha's numerical superiority. It's a lesson repeated throughout military history. Unity and coordination beat raw numbers. One final element worth noting, the role of weather and season. The battle occurred in late June. The Levantine summer. Temperatures would have been brutal, fighting in armor under the sun in extreme heat while already weakened by starvation. That's almost inhuman. Both armies suffered, but the Crusaders suffered more. They were already depleted. The heat would have accelerated dehydration and exhaustion. Yet they maintained cohesion and pressed the attack for hours. That level of physical endurance, under those conditions, borders on the impossible. But it happened. The human body, when pushed by absolute necessity, can endure far more than seems plausible. The Crusaders at Antioch proved that. So what do we take away from this? The Siege of Antioch and the battle that followed demonstrate that conventional wisdom isn't always correct. Everything about the Crusaders' situation said they should lose. They were starving, outnumbered, trapped, and facing fresh troops. Every rational analysis predicted their destruction. They won because they refused to accept that prediction. They attacked when they should have surrendered. They maintained discipline when they should have broken. They exploited enemy weaknesses when they should have been too weak to exploit anything. And they did all of this not because of miracles, but because of desperate, ruthless pragmatism combined with just enough organizational cohesion to execute a plan. This wasn't the largest battle of the Crusades. It wasn't the bloodiest, but it was the most consequential. Without victory at Antioch, there is no First Crusade, no Crusader kingdoms, no centuries of conflict in the Holy Land, no cultural exchange between East and West that defined the medieval period. One battle fought by starving men who should have died changed the trajectory of history for the next 200 years. That's not an exaggeration, that's just what happened. The Crusaders did the impossible, and the world shifted because of it. If this story taught you something, if it showed you a side of history you didn't know, here's what I need from you. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what you think. Subscribe to this channel because we're telling the stories that history classes skip. The battles that shouldn't have been won, the decisions that changed everything, the human moments buried in the violence, no fluff, no oversimplification, just history the way it actually happened. Thanks for watching. Now you know how starving Crusaders defeated a 40,000-man army, and you know it wasn't a miracle. It was strategy, desperation, and the refusal to die quietly.